Hello everybody, it's me, the Real Local Maniac. I'm back again with another 16-bit wars. Now, as you can see, today I'll be playing Midway's Mortal Kombat. Now, this is one of my favourite arcade games ever, and the reason why I'm doing this particular 16-bit wars is because in the last 1HMPS retro podcast, which was episode 4, which was titled Street Fighter 2 Fisting Edition, we talked about Street Fighter 2, and then we also talked about Mortal Kombat. We talked about the good, the bad, we talked about the 16-bit versions, and yeah, Melt recently did like a 16-bit wars video, and I thought I'd do my own version, so that way you can get more than one view on the particular series. So yeah guys, if you haven't checked out the last podcast, which was episode 4, you can find that on iTunes. You can also find that on the site as well. Right, so let's quickly go to the game itself. Now, the reason why I liked this game at the time was it was different enough to Street Fighter 2. Now, the problem I thought back in those days was, after Street Fighter 2, there were so many games that were pretty much exactly the same. They had the same sort of style graphics, the same sort of style look, you know, even the characters had all the same sort of moves. And it just basically felt the same. But with Midway, they dared to be that little bit different. One of the first things that stood out to me, and I think probably everyone else, was the digitized graphics. Now, fair enough, we had seen digitized graphics previously in games like Pit Fighter, but you know, Mortal Kombat took it completely to a different level. The other thing that stood out as well was its characters. It really had like an interesting bunch of characters. You had sort of like Sub-Zero, Kano, Liu Kang, Scorpion, and you had all these hidden characters as well, which made it really interesting. But I think the main thing that sold this game and what made this game work, took it beyond to another level, was the blood and of course the fatalities. Now, I can't do the fatalities, so don't expect seeing me sort of killing anyone with any fatalities, but Mortal Kombat, that's what made it, you know, work well. And I think Midway did a great job doing that, because they dared to be different and the game worked for that reason. If you stripped away the digitized graphics, if you stripped away the fatalities and the blood, I do think what you've got left is basically a very basic beat-em-up. But because it's got all these things, the game's got character and it works. I mean, look at that get over here thing, look at all that blood splurting out everywhere. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the blood is because the two 60-bit versions I'm going to talk about, one people hated because it didn't have blood, and one people loved because it did have blood. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to do like an interesting take on it, just to show you what I think of which was the better version, basically. But again, Mortal Kombat's a great game. It was really sort of like got into the media's attention because of all the violence and the gore. You know, people complained that it was over-the-top violent, you know. But all in all, it looks pretty tame, you know, nowadays. But back in sort of the early 90s, you know, it got a lot of attention. Right, so next up is the Sega Mega Drive version. Now, the Sega Mega Drive version was the version that people preferred. And the reason being, like I said previously, was because of the blood. Now, you didn't have the blood activated straight away. You used to have to enter this cheat code on the title screen. And I think, if I remember rightly, on the podcast, Malk mentioned it was Abacar that you have to enter. But I'm not going to enter that cheat code, and the reason being is I want to compare both games without blood and just try and see if we can look past the blood, what we're left with, basically. Okay, because people straight away looked at the Super Nintendo version and went, no blood, rubbish game. You know, Mega Drive version, got loads of blood, fantastic version. But no, I'm not going to do it that way. So there's the character select screen. Now, the music is fantastic. That's one thing I've got to give the Mega Drive version. The music is phenomenal. I really like that sound. If anything, I actually prefer it to the arcade version. Alright, so it looks pretty similar to the arcade down there, the way that it's all presented there. The graphics are slightly blockier, they haven't got as much colour. And there's Reptile. I remember the first time I saw him up here, I would be like, how on earth do I fight him, what do I do? And that was before the advent of the internet, so obviously, you know, you'd have to read computer magazines. Right, so like I said, the graphics aren't as colourful or don't look as good as the arcade version. You know, they lack that je ne sais quoi that makes any sense. But if anything, what this does have over the arcade game is basically the background suit this, the digitized graphics a little bit better. Because I found with the arcade game, it looked like it had digitized graphics stuck in a somewhat cartoony background, and that just didn't work. Now the sound effects are pretty decent, sound very similar to the arcade game. I basically find that the gameplay in this Mega Drive version is probably the easiest out of all the versions. And correct me if I'm wrong, when this game first came out, you could actually only use the 3-button Mega Drive control pad, which I thought was a bit of a pain in the ass, really. But overall, Mortal Kombat's a great game on the Mega Drive. I'm not saying I hate it, I don't hate the arcade game, I just never thought it was as good as Street Fighter 2. But like I said, the reason why I didn't activate the blood sheet is basically I want to compare it on the sound, the look, just all these little things that people overlooked when they were doing, the original 16-bit wars back in the days. But it's a decent conversion. It's lacking a few things, like I said. Like the graphics, it doesn't look as good as, it's a little bit easier, I think. But all in all, great conversion. I think Mortal Kombat 2 was a better game though. Right, so here is the Super Nintendo version. And here comes Goro. You can tell he goes to Fitness First. He should actually be on the poster for Fitness First. If they had Goro on Fitness First poster, I would go to the gym. Right, so anyway, this was the version that not a lot of people liked. Like I said previously, when Mortal Kombat first came out, it caused uproar and outrage because it had blood. And back in those days, Nintendo didn't do blood, they didn't do violence, they thought it was wrong. And they suffered big time, because more people bought the Mega Drive version as opposed to the Super Nintendo version. And it was something they sort of remedied when the second game came out. So it was a painful lesson for them because the Mega Drive version sold a lot more. And people preferred that version. Alright, so the first thing is the graphics are better than the Mega Drive version. They look that little bit more arcade-like. Music-wise, I actually prefer the Mega Drive version. Some of you guys may agree with me, some of you may disagree with me. But I actually prefer the Mega Drive version even more than the arcade. It just sounds a little bit better. So like I said, we stripped away the blood on the Mega Drive version. The Super Nintendo version didn't have any blood. It did have something that looked like sweat, so you were just basically left with sweaty fighters, like there, or looks like dust. The sound effects for a start are a lot better than the Sega Mega Drive version. They don't sound all sort of grainy. And and the sound effects sound a little bit more crispier as well when you hit people. And this is slightly tougher than the Mega Drive version. The Mega Drive version I found the first couple of levels too easy, and then the level difficulty shot up a little bit harder, but this is more consistent. And I think it does look like an overall better game. It does look more arcade-like than the, than the Mega Drive version. And I got my ass kicked there by Liu Kang. But I do love Mortal Kombat, It's just like one of the things we mentioned on the last podcast, which was basically hosted by myself, Otto72, Glenn 83100, and Mark 1976. It's a great podcast that we've done. It's probably the best one we've done so far. You can find that on the site, which is 1hourmonthlypodcastshow.co.uk, or you can find that on iTunes. And if you listen to it on iTunes, please give us a sex review. That would make us really happy. So, I think it's that time where I've got to try and choose a winner. Now, some of you may agree with me, some of you may disagree with me, but I'm actually going to go for the Super Nintendo version as the winner for today's 16-bit wars. Why? Graphics were better, had tougher gameplay, sounded better, looked more like the arcade game. The Mega Drive version was only famous for its blood. See you next time, guys.